The laughter felt like something from another room, a bright, booming sound that didn't quite belong in the same space as Eleanor. It was her brother, Richard, laughing, of course. He always laughed like that, a sound designed to draw everyone in, to make them part of the grand, wonderful spectacle that was his life. And as always, it was working. Their father, Arthur, was beaming. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes crinkling with pride. Their mother, Mary, let out a soft, admiring sigh, reaching over to pat Richard's arm. "Oh, you always tell the best stories," she said, her voice warm with adoration. Eleanor watched them from her side of the polished mahogany table. She managed a small, quiet smile, a gentle curving of her lips that she had perfected over decades. It was the smile of a spectator, a supportive background character in the dazzling play of her own family. The dining room was aglow, the scent of roast chicken and rosemary mingling with the expensive cologne Richard wore. Everything was perfect, polished, and happy, on the surface. And then, can you believe it? Richard continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that had the parents leaning in too. I told him, look, if you want the best, you have to be willing to pay for it. And he did, signed the contract right there. Another round of impressed noises. Eleanor picked at a loose thread on the linen napkin in her lap. She had paid for this dining set. Not that they knew it. It had been a Christmas gift 5 years ago, sent with a simple card signed with love. She had imagined them opening it, feeling the quality of the wood, never once thinking it came from her quiet, steady salary as a librarian 2 states away. It was just one of 1,000 quiet contributions, threads of support woven so seamlessly into the family fabric that they had become invisible. Her handbag sat on the floor beside her chair, its leather worn and familiar. It felt heavier than usual tonight. Inside, nestled between her wallet and an old, soft-covered book of poetry, lay the weight of the last 20 years. It was a single, folded document, the paper crisp and official, a truth held in reserve. "We're just so proud of you, son," Arthur said, finally taking a bite of his food. "Building your business, making a name for yourself. You've done so much for this family." "Well, someone had to step up," Richard said with a casual shrug, though his eyes gleamed with self-satisfaction. He gestured around the room with his fork. "Look at this house. It takes work to maintain a place like this. Real work." Eleanor's heart gave a familiar, painful squeeze. The house. The house was her quietest, biggest secret. She remembered the phone call 14 years ago. Her father, his voice strained with worry, talking about the bank, about the possibility of losing everything. She had just been promoted, her own finances finally stable after years of frugal living. That night, she hadn't slept. She had looked at her small savings, the money she'd earmarked for a down payment on a tiny apartment of her own, and made a choice. The choice that led to the document in her purse. "It's a beautiful home," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely rising above the clinking of silverware. "Mom and Dad have kept it wonderfully." Richard turned his gaze to her, and for the first time all evening, he seemed to truly see her. But there was no warmth in his eyes, only a kind of dismissive pity. "Well, sure, Ellie, but there's keeping it tidy, and then there's keeping it standing. There are real-world pressures you wouldn't understand." He said it without malice, which somehow made it worse. He said it as a fact, as if explaining the sky was blue to a child. The assumption of her ignorance of her gentle, sheltered, and ultimately inconsequential life hung in the air between them. Eleanor simply nodded, her gaze dropping back to her lap. The smile on her face didn't waver, but inside a slow, cold tide was beginning to rise. The laughter in the room sounded distant now, the warmth of the candlelight failing to reach her. She felt the solid weight of her handbag against her ankle, a silent anchor in the turbulent waters of the evening. Richard took another generous sip of wine, his eyes scanning the room as if he were a king surveying his domain. "It's all about responsibility," he declared, setting his glass down with a definitive click. "Knowing what needs to be done and doing it. That's what I've built my entire career on. It's what I've brought to this family. Responsibility." The word hung in the air, but for Eleanor it wasn't a grand concept. It was a series of quiet, specific moments etched into her memory. It was the frantic, tearful phone call from her mother nearly 20 years ago. Her father had fallen from a ladder while cleaning the gutters, a shattered hip. The surgery was covered, but the weeks of intensive physical therapy that followed were not. Richard, then in his final year of university, was deemed untouchable. "He has his finals, Eleanor," her mother had whispered, her voice fraught with panic. "We can't distract him. His future is everything." Eleanor, then just a few years into her first library job, looked at the numbers the hospital had given them. They were staggering. That same week, she had just been approved for a small car loan. She pictured herself driving something that didn't rattle every time it hit a bump. She pictured her brother, shielded and protected, striding toward his bright future. And in that moment, she made a choice. She called the dealership and canceled the loan application. For the next 8 months, she worked her day job at the public library, and 4 nights a week, she took the crosstown bus to a dingy data entry office, inputting sales figures until her eyes burned. She remembered the profound exhaustion, the feeling of living in a gray, blurry world, sustained by vending machine coffee and the grim determination to see it through. When she had enough, she sent the money in a cashier's check. The lie came easily. "I was part of a staff pool that won a small lottery prize," she'd chirped into the phone. "Isn't that incredible? I wanted you to have my share." The relief in her mother's voice was palpable, but it was followed by a comment that stung in its innocence. "Oh, Eleanor, you've always been the lucky one." "You are so right, dear," Mary said now from across the dinner table, her adoring gaze fixed on Richard. "We are so blessed. Some people, their children move away and you hardly hear from them. They get so caught up in their own little lives, you know." Eleanor's fork felt heavy in her hand. Her little life. Was that what they saw? A life without color, without drama, without significance? A wave of another memory washed over her. It was 10 years ago. She had saved for 3 years for a trip to the Scottish Highlands. A lifelong dream. The plane tickets were purchased, the itinerary was mapped out, a small bed and breakfast was booked. She could almost feel the cool, misty air on her skin. 2 weeks before her departure, another call. This time it was her father, his voice strained with a different kind of worry. The old furnace in the house had finally given out. In the middle of a brutal winter, the replacement cost was astronomical. "Don't you worry, Dad," Richard had said, put on the speakerphone from his office. "I'll look at my finances. Things are a bit tight with the new office expansion, but I'll see what I can move around." The call ended with promises but no solutions. A week passed. The house was frigid. Her parents were huddled around space heaters. Eleanor knew Richard's moving things around would never materialize. It was a gesture, a performance of intent. That evening, she sat at her small kitchen table, the Scottish travel guide open beside the furnace estimate. She looked at the photos of rolling green hills and ancient castles, and then at the stark, brutal number on the paper. With a sigh that felt like it came from the deepest part of her soul, she picked up the phone and canceled her dream. "A sudden, mandatory work training has come up," she had explained to her parents, forcing a tone of professional regret. "But the good news is, they refunded the entire trip. The money is just sitting here. Please, let me send it to you." The new furnace was installed the next day. Her parents' gratitude was immense, but it was directed at the universe, at the stroke of good luck that had solved their problem so neatly. Eleanor never told them she'd spent her vacation time at home, watching travel documentaries on television. "Exactly, Mom," Richard said, snapping Eleanor back to the present. He picked up the carving knife and gestured toward the remains of the chicken. "It's about showing up, not just with words, but with actions. Real, tangible support." He glanced at Eleanor, and this time there was a sharper edge to his expression, a glint of challenge. "It's easy to live a simple life when you have no one to worry about but yourself. No big risks, no major responsibilities." The hypocrisy of it was a physical blow. It stole the air from her lungs. He, who had been insulated from every family crisis, was lecturing her on responsibility. Her, who had been the silent, invisible safety net for 20 years. Her father must have sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. "Well, we've all done our part," he said, his voice gentle. "This family is strong because we all contribute what we can." It was an offering, a bridge across the suddenly tense silence. But Richard bulldozed right over it. He let out that laugh again, short, sharp, and utterly devoid of humor. It was a sound of dismissal. He looked straight at Eleanor, his smirk widening. "Come on, Dad. Let's be honest here," he said, his voice a weapon cloaked in casualness. "Ellie is great. She calls, she visits, she brings a nice bottle of wine. We love having her." He paused, letting the silence thicken, ensuring he was the absolute center of their world. "But when it comes to the heavy lifting, the things that really keep this family afloat, you never contributed? Not really." The words, "you never contributed," did not echo. They landed. They settled in the center of the room with a dead, final weight, absorbing all the light and warmth from the flickering candles. The cheerful clinking of silverware stopped. The The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly seemed as loud as a passing train. For a single, stretched-out second, Eleanor felt a profound and terrifying stillness. It was the calm at the very eye of the hurricane, a pocket of surreal silence where she could see every detail with crystalline clarity before the world tore itself apart. She looked at her brother. The smirk was still plastered on his face, an expression of such smug, unassailable certainty that it was almost fascinating. He believed what he was saying. In the carefully constructed narrative of his own success, she was a footnote, a minor character. He genuinely saw her as a guest in the grand drama of the family, a pleasant but peripheral figure whose contributions were limited to bottles of wine and polite Sunday phone calls. He had no concept, not even the faintest inkling, of the vast, hidden architecture of her sacrifice, the silent scaffolding that had held this family, this very house, upright for years. Then her gaze shifted to her parents. Her father, Arthur, had a flicker of deep discomfort in his eyes. He opened his mouth, a small, soundless O of protest forming, as if to soften Richard's brutal pronouncement. But no words came. He looked at his son, the booming, successful man who was the source of so much of his overt pride, and then at his quiet, unassuming daughter. In that moment of hesitation, Eleanor saw a lifetime of assumptions laid bare. He didn't know the truth, so how could he possibly defend her from a lie he didn't even recognize? He was a good man, her father, but he saw only what was presented to him, and Richard had always been the master of presentation. It was her mother, though, who broke her heart. Mary's face was a mask of soft, pained sympathy, but the pity was not for the injustice of the remark. It was for Eleanor herself. It was the exact look one gives a well-meaning child who has tried to lift something far too heavy and has, predictably, failed. Her mother's hand fluttered in the air, a delicate, aborted gesture of comfort from across the table. "Now, Richard, that's not a very nice thing to say," Mary chided gently, her voice laced with that patronizing sweetness. "Your sister, she does what she can. She does what she can." If Richard's words were a slap, her mother's were a slow, twisting knife. That was the epitaph for 2 decades of her life, for her foregone dreams, for her secret second jobs, for every check she'd ever written. It was meant as a defense, but it was the most profound condemnation of all. It confirmed Richard's entire narrative. It painted her as a sweet, simple person of limited capacity. A child, proudly presenting a clumsy crayon drawing to a family of architects. And in that instant, something inside Eleanor, a tightly wound coil of patience, deference, and ingrained restraint that she had carried for her entire adult life, finally, irrevocably, snapped. There was no scream, no tears, no dramatic gasp for air. The fire that had been smoldering in her chest didn't rage outward in a blaze of fury. Instead, it imploded, collapsing into a single point of pure, cold, diamond-hard clarity. It burned away all the fog of doubt, all the habits of self-effacement, all the instinct to smooth things over, to keep the peace. The peace had only ever been kept at her expense. She did not respond to her mother's pitiful defense. She didn't even glance at her brother's condescending smirk anymore. He had ceased to be the focus. He was just a catalyst, the ignorant voice that had finally spoken the family's secret, unspoken consensus. Her gaze dropped to the worn leather handbag at her feet. With a slow, deliberate grace that felt completely alien and yet utterly natural, she bent down and retrieved it. She placed it in her lap. The weight of it was no longer a burden. It was an anchor, a source of profound and solid strength. Her hands, to her own surprise, were perfectly steady as she opened the clasp. The metallic click it made was the only sound in the silent room, sharp and definitive. Richard watched her, a curious, almost amused expression on his face. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, as if he were waiting for her to pull out a tissue to dab at her eyes, to prove him right. Her parents watched with a gentle, worried confusion, their brows furrowed. What was poor Eleanor doing? Her fingers brushed past her wallet, the familiar worn leather of her coin purse, the soft, dog-eared cover of her book of poetry. They found what they were looking for, a crisp, folded rectangle of paper. She drew it out. The document was thick, professional, printed on heavy bond paper that felt official and unyielding. She unfolded it once, then twice. The sharp creases made a soft, authoritative crackling sound in the dead air. Finally, she looked up. She met her father's eyes first, then her mother's, and finally, her brother's. Her own gaze was clear, steady, and utterly devoid of the warmth they took for granted. The small, accommodating smile that had been her mask for so long was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable resolve. You were talking about this house, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a new timbre, a resonance of steel that cut through the silence with absolute precision. It was a voice none of them had ever heard her use before. You mentioned the heavy lifting, the real-world pressures, the things that really keep this family afloat. She held the document for a moment longer, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, with a calm, fluid motion, she extended her arm and placed it on the polished mahogany table, right next to the platter of half-eaten roast chicken. She gave it a gentle push. It slid across the gleaming wood, a silent white messenger, until it came to a stop directly in front of her father. Arthur looked down at it, his brow still furrowed in confusion. He squinted at the top of the page. In bold, stark, unambiguous letters were the words, Deed of Trust. And underneath that title, clearly listed in the unforgiving black and white of legal print, was the name of the sole owner of the property, the legal title holder of the home they were all sitting in, the one person who had saved it from foreclosure 14 years ago. The name was not Arthur Thompson. It was not Mary Thompson. It was most certainly not Richard Thompson. The name on the deed was Eleanor Thompson. Silence. It was a new kind of silence, deeper and more profound than the one that had followed Richard's insult. That had been a silence of tension, of awkwardness. This was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the sound of a world tilting on its axis. Arthur stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. His eyes scanned the document, moving from the top to the bottom, then back to the top again, as if a second reading might change the words printed there. He held the physical proof of a reality he had never conceived of. The rustling of the paper was the only sound in the room. Richard, for the first time in his life, looked utterly speechless. The smug, confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief. He leaned forward, squinting at the paper in his father's hand from across the table. "What is that?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. It came out as a strangled croak. Some kind of joke? Eleanor didn't answer him. She kept her gaze on her father. She watched as the dawning comprehension slowly, painfully, spread across his face. He looked up from the deed, and his eyes met hers. In them she saw a maelstrom of emotions, confusion, shame, and a flicker of something she had never, ever seen directed at her before. Awe. "Eleanor?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What is the meaning of this? I don't understand." "It's the deed to the house, Dad," she explained, her voice still quiet, still calm, but now imbued with an unshakable strength. 14 years ago, the bank was going to foreclose. You called me, remember? You said you were worried you were going to lose everything. The memory surfaced in her mother's eyes. Mary put a hand to her mouth, her face paling. "But we got a loan extension," she said faintly. "The bank manager was an old friend of your father's. He pulled some strings." It was the story they had told themselves, the palatable fiction they had constructed to protect their pride. Eleanor gave a small, sad shake of her head. "No, Mom. The bank manager couldn't help. The loan was in default. The only way to save the house was to pay the outstanding mortgage in full." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. "I had just been promoted. I had some savings. It was almost exactly the amount the bank needed." She didn't mention that it had been her entire life savings, the money for a home of her own. She didn't mention the years of quiet accumulation, of saying no to dinners with friends and vacations and new clothes. She didn't need to. The single piece of paper on the table said it all. You paid off the house?" Arthur asked, his voice cracking. "I did," Eleanor confirmed. "And in doing so, the title was transferred to my name. It was the only way. I kept the deed in a safe deposit box all these years. I never wanted you to know. I never wanted to make you feel ashamed. I just wanted you to be safe, to be secure in your home." Richard finally found his voice, but it was filled with a defensive, sputtering rage. "Why wouldn't you say anything? All these years, you let us believe. You just sat there, pretending to be—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Pretending to be what? The person he thought she was? The quiet, simple, inconsequential sister? Say anything? Eleanor turned her gaze to him at last. The fire was there now, not hot and raging, but cold and intensely focused. "What would I have said, Richard? When have you ever listened to me? When have any of you ever seen me as anything other than the quiet librarian, the dutiful daughter who lives her little life?" She used their own words, and they landed like well-aimed stones. "You stand here tonight," she continued, her voice rising slightly. And you talk about heavy lifting and responsibility. You who was shielded from every crisis. You who never had to choose between your dream and this family's survival. I made that choice. Over and over again. The physical therapy for Dad's hip, the new furnace, the monthly checks I've sent for the last 10 years that I told you were from a wise investment I'd made. Every word was a revelation, dismantling the entire foundation of their family's story. Mary began to weep, quiet, gulping sobs of shame and regret. Arthur just sat, staring at his daughter, his face a mess of emotions he couldn't hide. Eleanor slowly got to her feet. She picked up her worn handbag, the now blessedly light accessory. She looked at the three of them, sitting stunned and silent at the table she had paid for, in the house she owned. She felt no triumph, no desire to gloat, only a vast, cavernous sadness and a profound, liberating sense of release. I never wanted your gratitude, she said, her voice softening now. I just wanted your respect. I wanted to be seen, as an equal, as a contributor. She looked at her brother. You were right about one thing, Richard. I don't have the responsibilities you have. I don't have a business or a fancy title. My contribution wasn't loud. It wasn't something you could boast about at a dinner party. It was quiet. It was invisible. But it was real. She walked to the door of the dining room. She didn't say goodbye. There was nothing more to say. She left the deed on the table, a final, silent contribution. As she walked out of the house and into the cool night air, she felt the weight of 20 years lift from her shoulders. She didn't know what would happen next, if her family would ever speak to her again, if they could ever repair what had been broken. But for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor felt free. She had finally spoken her truth, not with shouts or accusations, but with the quiet, undeniable power of a single piece of paper. And she knew, as she started her car and drove away into the darkness, that her new life, her real life, the one she would build for herself from this moment on, was just beginning. And if her story could teach anyone anything, it would be this. Sometimes the deepest love and the heaviest burdens are the ones that are carried in silence. But truth, no matter how long it is hidden, has a weight of its own. And when it finally comes to light, it has the power to set you free. If you too have ever felt unseen or unappreciated, remember Eleanor. Remember to know your own worth, even when others don't, and have the courage to one day put your own deed on the table.